Hello, good evening. Welcome to this one-day UVA virtual talk series. My name is Susan Lynch. I am the Associate Director of Lifetime Learning at the University of Virginia's Office of Engagement. Over 1,100 people registered for today's event from 36 states and 21 countries spanning the globe. Today, we are joined by 5 distinguished panelists from the University of Virginia School of Architecture to discuss the future of cities. I will introduce the moderator and then she will introduce the rest of the panel. Isla Berman is the Dean of UVA's School of Architecture and the Edward E. Elson Professor. Berman is an architect, theorist, and curator of architecture and urbanism. His research investigates the relationship between culture and the evolution of contemporary material, technology, and special practices. So thank you, Dean Berman, for being here today and pulling together this panel that speaks to a topic that clearly resonates with so many. At the end of this presentation, panelists will answer audience questions submitted before and during the program as time allows. You may enter a question in the webinar Q&A. Please add your name and UVA affiliation. You'll find resources in the webinar chat. Please also note this program is being recorded and will be posted in Lifetime Learning's podcast library. So thank you again for joining us for this Lifetime Learning program. And now I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Dean Berman, to start the program. So it's all yours, Dean Berman.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I'm Isla Berman, Dean of the School of Architecture and also founder of our Next Cities Institute. And I have the honor of introducing our panelists this evening on the future of our cities. Cities, which currently house the majority of people on this planet and are expected to house 75% of the world's population by 2050, and anticipated 7.5 billion people, are not only the dominant environments that we occupy and live in, they are also the place where creativity and economy, community and culture, and innovation and technology come together. They are our most complex cultural artifacts and certainly our largest collective human creations. They are also responsible for 80% of the world's resource consumption, and therefore their strategic reconception is crucial to our future. The pandemic and its effects on cities has also been making us rethink how we collectively occupy and use space. We all certainly miss traveling and the vibrancy of public urban life, yet we don't miss spending hours a day in commuter traffic, and we find that other benefits have emerged, such as the air pollution clearing over major cities or wildlife beginning to reemerge in the places we least expected. Cities are the products of many different disciplines, from architecture and landscape architecture to urban planning and design, all fields of study that we offer at the School of Architecture. Tonight's panel, which will introduce you to some of the tremendous research and design work happening at our school, will give you a cross-section of our fields, while also raising some of the critical questions around how we make our cities more livable, more intelligent, more resilient, and more equitable. One of the threads that will tie all the panelists' presentations together today will be the relationship of urban environments to landscapes and ecologies, and the importance of thinking about the nexus of cities and nature. As a side note, each of our panelists has behind them a different scaled view of the same city, which will be the only quiz at the end of today's talks, which is, can you identify which city this is? We have 4 speakers with us today. The first is Shiqiao Li, the Wheaton Professor in Asian Architecture, an architect, an architectural historian, and director of our cross-disciplinary PhD program, who will draw upon his understanding of the effects of economics on the city and his multicultural expertise bridging the East-West divide to bridge the human-nature divide that we've constructed, to make an argument for the reconception of landscape through the lens of the spiritual and material, and to redefine how we understand the values of land, space, and nature. His argument is that the true future of cities will be dependent on modifying our current property ownership model to shift cities away from being products of pure financial speculation, a current path that is untenable for the city of the future. Mona El-Khafif, who will come next, an associate professor of architecture and urban design, coordinator of our New York studio, and director of our urban design program, will discuss the different models for the ways in which cities are designed and built. We generally understand cities being planned and designed from above, operating from the very large master plan to the small scale over a long period of time. Mona will argue that given the rapidity of informal urbanization processes, that the future of our cities will depend on new forms of collaboration and bottom-up design approaches, smaller scale, tactical urban prototypes that can be implemented across public spaces to address macro-scaled urban challenges and improve the livability of our cities. Brian Davis, an associate professor of landscape architecture, who's in the process of developing the school's Land Lab, a landscape experimentation station, and whose work and research deals with large-scale ecologies and territories, will talk about the importance of water as a source and a resource, and about the future necessity of wet lands in relation to our cities and landscapes. We love water and we love land, but few of us love wetland. We have most often drawn a strong and hard barrier between water and dry land, and yet the amphibious nature of soggy terrain is a critical part of the fluid nature of environmental ecologies. Working with water is extremely complex, and our past, which adopted an engineering model of channelizing water of all forms, will not perhaps be the best predictor of future changes on the horizon. And our last panelist, Tim Beatley, the Heinz Professor of Sustainable Communities, a professor of urban and environmental planning, and the director of the Biophilic Cities network, will discuss how the pandemic is shaping our connections with and perceptions of nature and wildness in cities. He will discuss the promise of biophilic cities as a vision for future cities and review some of the steps that cities are already taking to infuse nature into their urban environments. From whales to otters to birds, he'll discuss how cities are working to coexist with and make room for other species. I hope tonight's talks will be thought-provoking and inspiring. And with that, I will pass this over to our first panelist, Chu Chao Lee.
Thank you, Ayla. It's a great pleasure to be able to join this panel. My talk tonight is called More Landscape, Less Construction. The future of cities will be more landscape and less construction. This will be the foundation for many other city features of the future. More walking and cycling, and less driving and flying. More sharing, less privatization. More healthy living, less environmental destruction. More biology, less cyborg. But I want to stress that I mean something very specific with more landscape and less construction. Let's talk about them one by one. More landscape. Here I don't mean a lot of nice plants and beautiful views. This is actually the idea of landscape that we need to overcome for the future. What I do mean is that landscape and humans are actually made of same materials, and we have the same spirituality. Many ancient cultures can think like this, but we have developed an idea in the past 400 years that nature and humans are different. And this is the great modern nature-human divide. With this divide, we frame a use and abuse relationship with nature. We love it when we can use it, but then we hate it when we cannot. For landscape to make sense in the future, we must re-examine this nature-human divide and perhaps reinvent ancient sensibilities. The French anthropologist Philippe Descola calls the Western nature-human divide a kind of naturalism, i.e., everything with the same materiality, but different spirituality. He calls the ancient culture's sensibilities as a kind of animism, i.e., everything with different materiality, but same spirituality. In many ancient cultures, nature is actually not a concept. There were not even words for nature as a separate entity from ourselves. A similar attitude can also be found in the way ancient Chinese culture thinks about landscape. Because the Chinese language actually thinks with shapes, it has a very different understanding of the spirituality of things in landscape. Literally, landscape in that cultural context thinks. Descartes calls it analogism. The Chinese word for nature is a modern made-up word. It actually means at ease with oneself. The archetypal human spirituality is rights, human rights. In the future city, landscape will hold rights. It is not a landscape of human charity, of environmentalism, as a demonstration of our kindness and care. Landscape has rights because their spirituality is just like ours, and this is the only foundation for its beauty. Now, construction. I believe that we construct more than we need, and we distribute our construction unequally. This is unfortunate. I believe that we do this not out of evil, but as a consequence of an economic system we designed. We see construction less as need and art, more like money. The real estate market has an enormous value. There are actually people in the world who would calculate how much it is. And here's an example of how much the real estate in total is in the world, and estimated in 2017, which is around $200 trillion. We place high monetary value on construction and turn it into mortgages, mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, pension funds, hedge funds, sovereign funds, all staged internationally with unimaginable speed, size, and complexity through the financial market. At the same time, we don't have a value for the biosphere. This is a destructive distortion. The overvaluation of construction is deliberate. It serves a crucial psychological function for us as a measure of possession. The Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson says that, in fact, freedom is often misconceived as a function of possession. This is what John Locke began and what Thomas Jefferson inherited. And this has inflamed our passion to add more and more construction because it is more possession, and care less and less about the environment because it doesn't really have value. The possessive individualism dominates our geopolitics. In many ways, it's rather preposterous for humans to claim exclusive ownership of land and ecology. In my mind, perhaps no different from for humans to claim exclusive ownership of another human being's body. I want to argue with Macpherson that possession does not give rise to freedom. Possession is not black and white. And here's actually a summary in a slide of a kind of spectrum of possession of property, if you like, and with a very interesting middle ground that gives us room for designing the foundation for cities in the future. As it is today, this inflamed passion for construction is the root cause for the decline of architecture. The demand for return on investment with very short cycles is inherently conventional and produces vast amount of mediocre formulaic architecture. I'm not bringing up a utopia, merely a willingness to experiment for the future. I want to introduce a project, a new city being planned and built near Beijing called Xiong'an. The city has two really interesting strategies. First, landscape is the planning principle. Second, there will be a new joint property ownership model. Interestingly, American firms have contributed significantly to the development. Tom Leader's studio and SOM produced a winning master plan for the starter area, and Esther Lawrence and I have consulted on the concept of the city. The master plan is framed around the 24 solar terms on the Chinese calendar, making the city and landscape deeply intertwined. It works with the Chinese cultural life to see seasonal change as work, food, beauty, and spirituality. The concept of the city from the start is grounded in a very different property ownership model, joint public and private ownership. There will be no real estate speculation. When Adam Smith saw the Dutch tulips bubble in the 17th century, he thought that it was a sign of an unnatural economy, chasing shadows of the market rather than market itself. Real estate speculation strongly, to me, resembles that unnatural economy. Just that real estate speculation is determining how cities are built today, while tulips did not. McPherson would be happy, I'm guessing, to see the toning down of possessive individualism in Shonan. A real estate speculation will no longer be the defining feature of the city. Instead, there will be a moderated housing market. With these two fundamental modifications, we are set in a very different direction. The cynics will probably say, well, this is another construction, but the optimists will say experiments are the most effective way to find a better future. From here, principles can be retrofitted onto older cities. Faced with creating futures, we can either extend the shelf lives of current real estate speculation-based city models through resilience, or we can try a different economy and a different city. I would certainly bet on the future of a different economy for cities. I want to remind everyone that America was a leader in the economy and politics of communality under FDR. Games are self-perpetuating if rules are not changed. We can perhaps understand real estate, finance, and ecological systems in a similar way. The future of cities depends on new rules for landscape and construction. Here, landscape is understood as thought, as rights-holding entities, as a control system for economy. More landscape will mean more natural economy that decenters real estate and construction. Less construction will mean more architectural innovation, unburdened with its role as money instruments. There will be a new architectural renaissance to lift the city out of its business of decorating and hosting real estate speculation schemes. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. I would like to introduce, hand over to Mona or Khafif, my colleague, for the next talk. Mona.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I am excited and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. My presentation will deal with urban regeneration processes, the way how we can repair existing cities and how we can repair this for the upcoming challenges, among some of them rising sea level, but also livability in our cities, and how we can do this in an interdisciplinary way and also in a very collaborative way. What you see here on the first slide is Venice. It's probably a city, whether you visit it or not, you are probably familiar with. It's a type of city which syncs very well with my title, urban prototyping, thinking about elements that can be repeated in a city, but that also need to be innovated. So as such, Venice as a whole is a water city, and we can understand it as a type, but it went through a kind of history until it became the place that we know today, that is also, again, challenged by rising sea level. There's a fantastic paper that was published by Richard Hindle, who talked about the Venice model, that the idea of the patent was actually invented during the Renaissance. And the city understood that if it wants to flourish, it has to reinvent itself and has to reinvent its techniques to make the city. So it will be interesting for you who are maybe lawyers, economists, innovators, engineers, because the city invited people like these professions from all over Europe to invent new technologies of dredging, building canals, etc. And only this patent law that then also facilitated prototyping in the city, facilitated that Venice could become the hub that it was for many centuries to follow. And the model actually traveled across the United States. So the idea that I want to present today is maybe, and I'm agreeing with the author, that we need to go back to this model of reinventing our cities, not through the large master plan, but maybe through the different components that make our cities, like the screws in a machine. And what you see here, Venice is going to be challenged in the next future, but also other cities. And it's not only about rising sea level, it is about a very polluted water that is going to come, acidity is increasing, storm events are happening more often. And whether we like it or not, we have to really think into the moment where we have to protect our cities again and collaborate with the water that is going to come in the next centuries. I'm currently working, there were a couple of questions of the audience, also showing material that we work with our students, develop with our students. So this semester I'm working with a larger group of team members in Norfolk, also with the resilience office in Norfolk. And if you know the place, it's highly constructed. 90% of the city over its history is man-made land with a lot of hard edges. And floods in the summer caused by rain and also rising sea level are a huge issue the city is facing. So in our first analysis phase, we already looked at how the water wants to come back through the natural drainage system that the city originally had, which were the creeks, and how it really comes back and tries to take back the land that was originally wetland. And what you can see here on the right, yesterday we had Hank Ovich in our studio. Hank is a water consultant hired by or working for the Dutch government, a country that is by 50% under sea level. And he really made the point that we cannot continue reacting on catastrophes. We have to be much more proactive. Otherwise, we will never be prepared for the upcoming challenges that all our students' generations will experience. There are fantastic typologies that had been developed. There was recently one of the first new publications that in a very holistic way look at the Dutch dikes, how they were constructed over the last 2,000 years and protected the country from the rising sea level. And in this exploration, they are also looking at that the dike, as we maybe knew it from the past, simply a device that was able to produce public space, but also protects the country, has to be understood as a typology and has to be reinvented and hybridized. What you see here on the right-hand corner is an estuary. It's a dike system that was intentionally opened so that fish migration can take place. So we need to think about how we can live with the water, but also how other species can live with the water, which causes that we have to rethink the types that we might work with in the past. Again, similar projects from the Netherlands. On the left, you can see the Water Square. It's a plaza in Rotterdam that was designed to function as a public space on a normal daily basis. But when heavy rainfalls are occurring, this plaza becomes a water plaza, a water infrastructure, because it is important that we learn to start living with the water instead of hiding it, and that we start celebrating it. On the right-hand side, examples from the first floating master plan in Eiburg, a completely artificial island in the Netherlands, where again, the public space becomes the bluescape. But I also want to maybe talk about other kinds of typologies that we can look at. So the earlier slides were highly interdisciplinary professional types that you certainly need an engineer to think about dikes. But there is another movement that's happening over the last 10, 15 years that we might call tactical urbanism. In tactical urbanism, city planners, residents, designers, and artists are all working together to increase the quality of specifically public spaces in our cities. And I want to show you some of these examples. These are Gale architects who revitalized Broadway in New York. And they started doing this by first shutting down the Broadway on a Saturday afternoon. I remember the notice in the radio station. I was at this time living in San Francisco. And I thought, what are they doing in New York? And they tested it. It was a prototyping attempt to shut down Broadway on a very specific sequence and to show specifically business owners that shutting it down is not a disadvantage, but will increase circulation of pedestrians, and even activities in case of shopping, going to a cafe, etc. What emerged from these initiatives when Gail thought about, do we really need so much space for our cars, is the New York Public Plaza program that is actually in collaboration with the Department of Transportation and not with the Plaza or Park program. And they are carving away the large footprint, very often 30% of our cities that are dedicated to traffic. When we go from New York to San Francisco is also a city that initiated a lot of tactical urbanism projects. What you see here on the slides are first interventions to redesign the sidewalks. It was initiated by Jane Martin, a landscape architect, in 2004, when her own house was flooded. And she thought we have to design our sidewalks in a different way so that they can absorb the water. She generated a program, it's called Plant NSF, generated a manual. And today, when you walk through the neighborhoods, a lot of owners took this on. They are building this themselves, or they hire landscape architects, and whole neighborhoods are transforming and implement green infrastructure. 2 years later, or 1 year later, Rebar, an activist and landscape team in San Francisco, developed the idea of parking day. They just rented a parking spot and put a green piece of lawn on it and a bench. And they said, if I can pay for parking, I can also pay for having a little spot of public space. This tactical urbanism, and we can call it guerrilla urbanism, initiated a global movement today called Parking Day. You can go to the website, download the manual, you know exactly all the things you have to take care of so that it's not causing a hazard. And on one day a year, the world very often turns the parking spots into little green gardens. Our own students are participating in it. And if you're interested, it's on September 17th this year. And it's a movement that, again, takes place all over the world. What emerged from this in San Francisco in their program is the Streetlit typology, and they are testing it. Again, it's based on manuals. The idea that, for example, restaurant owners or gallery owners, etc., can rent from the city for a specific flat rate the parking spot that sits in front of their entity. And they are asked to design this together with architects or landscape architects. And this then becomes an extension of the public space that benefits the city, it benefits the users, it benefits the business. And again, the city is not even losing profit as the owners of the cafes and restaurants are paying for it. This is not a new idea. I like to quote those early thinkers who started to think about how can we, through multiplication, find opportunities to increase the quality in our cities across the city's field. So it's a distributed idea of typologies that then operates in multiple neighborhoods. What we have here is a map of Aldo van Eyck, a Dutch architect, who after the Second World War discovered that A, there were no playgrounds for a whole generation of kids, and B, there were a lot of empty lots because the wounds of the Second World War were evident in the city. So he initiated a project that he calls the city as a playground. And I designed a whole manual of instruments that could be plugged into these void spaces. And over his lifespan, he designed more than 700 kindergarten and playgrounds for the city, and again, changed a whole generation of childhood experience. So I'm fascinated by this topic. How can we rethink typologies that are repeating across cities? Here I looked at more than 239 city-owned parking lots in Toronto, a city that is desperately running out of its public spaces. This is not a unique situation. A lot of land in American cities is dedicated to standing traffic. Very often they are empty, so we should look at how they are actually used. But what is even more important is that we say when a parking lot is empty on a Sunday and on a Monday or on a Saturday, this space could be used for something else. And we just have to design the surfaces in a way that they can accommodate for this time-based hybridity. These are just a couple of slots how we are working through this project, generating inventories, generating typologies. In this context, I developed 9 typologies. Also inventing the tools, how we can work together with the community, with the planning department, and with residents and stakeholders in the neighborhood. And how important it is that we look at new ways of how we are actually designing this. We need to think about how we design the transformation, what's happening on Sunday, Monday, Friday, how it can transform over time when suddenly everyone understands we don't need the parking lot in the first place, and how we are communicating this to our stakeholders and partners. These are just a couple of projects where we also looked at malls, and in this case, this was a student project. This is my last slide. There were questions how we can improve our cities during COVID, or what we learned during COVID. I was invited to a panel in San Francisco after urbanism, or urbanism after Corona. And a lot of the panelists actually talked about that we need to rethink the way how we are using our public spaces. That, for example, a parking lot during Corona, where nobody is driving a car in the first place, might be used for something else, that we have to integrate much more flexibility in our cities to look for new kinds of typologies that can, in the future, support the quality of our cities, and that we should do this in a collaborative way. Thank you very much. This was my quick presentation. I'm handing over to Brian Davis. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Davis, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you all and have the opportunity to share a few thoughts tonight about our cities and what their future might look like, specifically through a landscape architectural lens. It's amazing to see the sort of cross-pollination between the talks so far. I feel very fortunate to be a part of it. And I think you'll see a number of themes that are sort of continuing as I start to chat. So I'm a landscape architect, and so I have a bias. And nonetheless, I'll confess that I think of landscape as a foundation of democracy. And much like real democracy, it's often unruly and rarely does exactly what we intend or want. And I think this holds really well for wet landscapes in particular. And in part because of that, I think wet lands are really important to think, to work, and to engage with. Many of our urban forms, such as housing, our infrastructures, but also our land use policies, financial mechanisms, and floodplain maps, they all assume a stable, knowable environment. And dealing with the difficult, unruly, but also beautiful and productive nature of wet landscapes is one of the major challenges I see of a world where the past is no longer a good predictor, a good predictor of future performance. So I'd like to begin with this short quote or passage from George Perkins Marsh, because I think it's illuminating for some of the challenges that our cities and society faces today. It says, "The earth is fast becoming an unfit home for its noblest inhabitant. In another era of equal human crime and human improvidence, and of like duration with that through which traces of that crime and that improvidence extend, would reduce it to such a condition of impoverished productiveness, of shattered surface, of climatic excess, as to threaten the deprivation, barbarism, and perhaps even extinction of the species." And he writes this in 1864, and though the style is a bit different, I think the insight and the concern is very contemporary. We hear reflections like this a lot. And Marsh was writing after, he's reflecting on the impacts of 150 years of industrial society in the United States and Europe in particular. And it's worth noting that it's now been 157 years since he made this conclusion. So the low-lying wetlands of settlements and cities, they've long been positioned outside of the productive circuits of those cities. We needed their water for drinking and for waste disposal and transportation, but the wetlands themselves were a kind of enigma or a threat. So they were something to pass over or through, to drain or to fill, to convert into real estate, as Shiqiao was explaining, but not something to value on their own terms. This has been really difficult for our society for a while. A great example of that is the Swamplands Act of 1850 in the United States. This is when the federal government still controlled huge swaths of land. And they passed a law where the states could have federal swampland if they would promise to drain it and to put it into productive agricultural use. This is how a massive project to drain the Everglades in Florida was undertaken. In fact, it was passed specifically to spur that undertaking, but it was used to affect change over massive landscapes across the country. But of course, these landscapes, they persisted. These wetlands persisted. The wild productivity of these liminal zones between water and land has been something that's drawn us and other things to them for as long as we can remember. Here in these wetlands, interaction, work, productivity, and beauty all come together. And I love showing this image when I'm teaching with students, and sometimes when I'm trying to convince a client or someone of a project and the value of wetlands. This painting by Richard Adams in 1832 of the city of Buenos Aires. He's looking at this city, and it has a kind of picturesque background, this very sort of Spanish colonial, beautiful architecture. But the thing that he foregrounds is not that. It's the Ribera, the muddy floodplain. This is where everything grows, where all the exchange happens, where all the labor takes place, or a lot of the labor takes place. It was a kind of foundation, an aesthetic foundation for his vision of and his understanding of Buenos Aires. But Adams is rare, or he was rare. That's not our normal sort of stance on our cities and their landscapes. It's much more common to see water as a threat. And that has provoked, especially over the 20th century, a tradition of building heroic infrastructure that walls off the threat. And so here you can see the massive seawall in Galveston, on Galveston Island, near Houston, Texas. And you just think about the massive sort of undertaking that this required, the accumulation of capital and labor and ingenuity necessary to produce this type of structure. Of course, it doesn't come from a bad place. If you're living on Galveston Island, there's a very real need not to be flooded constantly every time, or at least every time a hurricane comes through. But the selection and the construction investment in this particular form is not a given. It's what we came up with based on our values. But our society doesn't only see these, at least from my perspective, we don't only see these watery landscapes as a threat or as something we don't understand. They're also understood as they're understood as a resource. They do work for us, and we do work in them. In this case, this is the shipping terminal at the Port of Baltimore. And we can kind of take it for granted, but a lot of our waterways are huge highways that we don't have to pay to build. We do have to pay to maintain them through dredging, but they're constantly doing a tremendous amount of work that our society relies on for its economy and exchange, for the, making sure we can all get the shirts that we're going to wear, or sell coffee to another country. And this quality of these watery lands, I think, in a kind of basic and fundamental and cultural way, they've always provided jobs, places where labor was meaningful, and they have tended to incubate an ethic of conservation, of some desire to preserve the quality of these places. And that includes, the need to get food out of, we sort of take advantage of how productive these landscapes are. How many fish are growing there, or crabs or oysters or whatever, or how many ducks love to fly over them because of the fish. And we take our own food from them. We also love these places for the recreation that they offer, not literally, and not recreation in the sense that we'll often think about today, like a stroll in the park or some pleasant diversion, but literally the act of it's closer to what Shiqiao was referring to, actually, sort of in a spiritual way, nourishing our soul in a way that book learning or any of the other things that we engage in just doesn't always do. So that gets to maybe the final sort of piece that these landscapes offer us, and that they're a kind of a cultural source, a place of inspiration and attraction. They're also fundamentally dynamic, and they're more dynamic now than they have been over the whole of human history, and that's a pace that's accelerating, we know. This incredible landscape photographed by the photographer David Harp that you're looking at, it's actually quite common throughout the Chesapeake Bay and much of the East Coast. It's a stand of loblolly pines now turned into a ghost forest because of saltwater intrusion. And actually, this whole area would have been a salt marsh, or I'm sorry, it is now a salt marsh, would have been a productive farmland 100 years ago, 120 years ago. Maybe drained by some of the practices that we were noting earlier. So the costs of the threats seem to be growing, even as our connection, our sort of spiritual and economic connection to these places is tending to diminish, or to these watery landscapes is tending to diminish. And this will probably accelerate in a lot of the places that we all live in, a lot of our cities. A warmer atmosphere is leading to more intense storms in many areas. So even inland, a lot of cities are facing a lot more inland flooding. The 100-year storm, for instance, is a kind of historically based predictor of future performance, and those are happening much more frequently in many places. This is Nashville in 2010, not a coastal city, obviously. And so one of the responses, there's a tremendous amount of innovation that I think many of those listening here today probably have experienced some of these places, and we study them with students. I study them myself. Innovative practices that cities are implementing based on historical knowledge sometimes. So a great example is this project, the Buffalo Bayou in Houston, taking a water course that floods sometimes and turning it into a parkland that offers tremendous recreation opportunity for a really dense and vibrant city. This was a project designed primarily, I think, by SWA, and with many incredible consultants. But one of the sort of challenges that I think cities are facing going forward is, keep in mind a lot of our assumptions for how to design these places that matter to us are based on the idea of how they functioned in the past, and that's shifting now. I think that necessitates a more experimental attitude, and prototyping actually is one of the ways I would offer is a kind of way forward to try something small, learn from it, rather than making a massive capital investment. Not only is the construction of buildings a massive capital investment, but also the construction of certain types of landscapes. Need to keep in mind that has the same effect. And the waters that we rely on and which attract us, they often don't conform or stay within the land use plans and urban designs that we create with and for them. So this is that same park, Buffalo Bayou, after Hurricane Harvey. And it makes no sense to have a parkland that's buried in 4 feet of sediment. But that's what happens in a river plain or a river floodplain sometimes. It's rare, but it is a thing that is sort of fundamental to those types of landscapes. And probably it's going to be happening more. These types of disruptions and dislocations. And so we need to rethink the park paradigm, where these places are invested with large capital, constructed according to a certain picturesque aesthetic. And we need to, this paradigm has served our cities as a primary way of providing recreation, so serving a public health need, which has become all the more important in light of the pandemic. And they've also historically organized our urban development and urban form, at least over the last 150 years, since they were invented as a response to the industrial city. probably, one direction to go is a more complex park paradigm that merges conservation and social justice with an environmental land ethic and a new aesthetic, or an evolved aesthetic. So what you're looking at here is a park proposal by the firm Mahan Reichel Associates in Baltimore. And they're looking at how the active movement of sediment can be a part of the coastal fringe of this parkland and offer aesthetic, recreational, and fishing opportunities for a community that's traditionally been sort of left out of planning plans in the city, historically Black community. Another move would be to go away from the explicitly park program and land use plan entirely, moving toward landscapes, watery landscapes that provide education and science-based restoration practice. These are places where work and learning can happen in a kind of natural and quotidian way that would enrich the knowledge and skills of the generations that are coming up to be able to take on the work that is not only part of their generation, it's actually we need it right now, and it's happening right now, but we are going to need much more of it. And this is an example of the Harbor School in New York City and their Billion Oyster Project. And another example is linking the work of harbor and marina navigation more directly with wetland and beach creation. So no longer seeing these materials that are sort of produced as waste products in our urban constructions and processes, like the maintenance of a navigation channel. We're trying to move away from seeing those as waste products and seeing them as opportunities to recreate watery, rich landscapes. This is an example on Lake Ontario in Port Bay. And I think if we stop coming to these watery landscapes, if we don't find a way to engage them or continue to find new ways to engage them and on their own terms, they're going to come to us, and they're going to come, through rising sea levels and increased flooding, and they're going to come to us with all the pollutants and residues that we've pushed into them. The wetlands are coming back, the ones that we filled and drained for our older modes of industrial urbanism. And just as you saw actually perfectly in Mona's presentation, but just how they come back, just where and what their effect will be is up for debate. And I think that this question is one of the great aesthetic and moral questions of the future of our cities. Thank you. I'm gonna now pass the mic to my colleague, Tim Beatley in the planning department.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That was wonderful. I want to talk today about the role of nature in cities, and in particular, what the role that nature plays in our vision of post-pandemic cities. And my main message is going to be that the pandemic has reinforced for us how essential nature is in our lives. It's been a solace, a balm, really an essential saving grace in these really difficult and stressful times. Even before the pandemic, we've been advocating for a new vision of cities, what we call biophilic cities, based on this idea of biophilia, this innate connection that we have, this innate love of nature that we have. And these are cities that put nature at the center of design and planning. Nature, we think, is not optional. It's absolutely essential to leading a happy, healthy, and meaningful life. And it's a vision of the world where nature is not something separate from or apart from our daily experience. It's an uplifting and restorative and ever-present part of our urban lives. We need to work to design compact, dense, walkable, outdoor-oriented cities that connect us to nature. That's certainly true. Partly this is about the importance of biophilic design and biophilic buildings. Here's a project called Designer's Walk. Several hundred trees in this new tower in Toronto with tree planting space designed into the very floor plates of the building. and also a note to the, the essential role of things like terraces and balconies. We know that they connect residents to nature, and we've seen how important they've been in the pandemic. Or a building like this one, the Phipps Conservatory's Center for Sustainable Landscapes in Pittsburgh. It's a wonderful biophilic design that incorporates many wonderful natural features, extensive natural daylight, views of nature, natural ventilation, a public green roof. It's also a certified living building. So that means it's net zero energy. It produces as much energy as it needs. It's also net zero water. We have, by the way, a 5 or 6 minute film about this building. I think there's a link to it in the resources page that you've been given. So Biophilic City is really a creative mix of the designed and human built and the organic and the living. It's a blended urban matrix of nature. It includes living walls and green rooftops and sky parks, but it's also rivers and forests and wetlands and meadows and the remnant nature that we find in cities. And increasingly, our cities, the cities in our network, aspire to a vision of immersive nature, where nature is all around us. It's interconnected and it's seamless. Yes, it's about biophilic buildings, but it's about much more than that. And we sometimes speak in terms of room or rooftop to region or bioregion and all of the scales and spaces in between. And what we need to do, we think, is move from a model of cities that sees nature in certain places in that city that you have to visit, but to one of understanding the city as a holistic ecosystem, which it is. Singapore is one of our best examples of this shift in thinking. Changing the way they even describe themselves. For many years, they described themselves as Singapore, a garden city, and they shifted more recently to saying Singapore, a city and a garden, and more recently still, a city in nature, or a biophilic city in nature, which is how they are often talking about it, which seems a little bit redundant, but it's a kind of redundancy we like. So in 2013, we helped to form a network of cities called Biophilic Cities. And we now have 24 cities. Toronto is the most recent one joining. We think Peru is very close to joining as well. And we do many things in this network. And this is Mayor Bill Peduto in Pittsburgh receiving the membership certificate after joining the network. But we collect and share best practices. We tell inspiring stories from our cities, often through films. We publish an online journal. We organize meetings and conversations between cities. And we've recently developed an online platform allowing our cities to work together around a series of working groups, actually supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm actually going to skip back to this past slide. One of the things that's really interesting about this building, which I wanted to say, was that this is a wonderful design by Woha, a wonderful firm doing amazing work on biophilic buildings. And it represents, in many ways, the vision that Singapore has of this nature immersive city. So it is a city, it is a building that replaces the ground level nature lost by more than 200%. And they have another project, the Oasia Downtown Hotel, which replaces that ground level nature by more than 1,200%. And the city-state of Singapore has been supporting this through a number of policies and initiatives, including a kind of green area ratio standard, something they called their landscape replacement policy. So you are required to basically replace at least one to one the area, the nature lost by the footprint of the building. But increasingly, builders and developers and architects are in this sort of friendly competition to see how much nature they can incorporate into their buildings. And so it is very much a demonstration of this idea of a seamless, interconnected city of immersive nature. So the green roof or the green wall that connects to the tree canopy, that connects to multiple layers of tree canopy, that connect to ground level parks and nature. So there are a diversity of approaches that our cities are taking to protecting, restoring, celebrating the nature, many different programs and initiatives from stream daylighting in Vitoria-Gasteiz to park connectors in Singapore, to creative programs for inserting nature. For instance, San Francisco, Mona mentioned this already, but San Francisco's experience with sidewalk gardens and actually creating a new permit that allows residents to essentially get permission to take up pavement and to plant gardens, sidewalk gardens. We know we also need profoundly more just and equitable cities, and that applies especially to enjoying nature. The pandemic has highlighted and amplified these inequalities as neighborhoods of color have fewer green spaces, less nature, fewer parks, and the parks that exist are smaller. So these are images from our partner city, Richmond, Virginia, and they're sort of leading the way. Like many American cities, we see here the impact of systemic racism and racial segregation, and it certainly, again, shapes the amounts and kinds of nature available to enjoy. And this is a new draft of their comprehensive plan, and it will establish minimum tree canopy targets, and it will focus on underserved neighborhoods that are high on the heat vulnerability index. Here is Mayor LeVar Stoney, Mayor of Richmond, announcing the creation of 5 new parks in neighborhoods of color in that city. Wonderful leadership. So a future city is a just and equitable city. A biophilic city is a just and equitable city. So we've been especially interested in seeing what cities have been doing in real time to make nature and the outdoors more accessible, streets and parks more accessible. And we have many of our partner cities have done wonderful things, very creative things. Here you see the Slow Streets network in San Francisco, even closing their Great Ocean Highway, making it pedestrian. We'll see what happens after the pandemic and whether these closures, in fact, will continue. I think many of them will. And the pandemic has really vividly demonstrated, I think, how essential nature is. And we've seen an unprecedented desire to be in and near nature. So there are a couple of images from other partner cities in our network. On the left is Forest Park in Portland, Oregon, one of the largest parks in that city, experiencing unprecedented demand. They've had to organize a series of one-way hiking loops to accommodate all the visitors. So another aspect of the pandemic, as Isla mentioned, has been the discovery or the watching of wildlife. And there have been a lot of news stories and commentary about how animals have taken over spaces vacated by humans during our lockdown. And that's certainly true. And I do think this will make a difference after the pandemic. But already in many cities like Singapore, which you see here, there have been active efforts to make room for and coexist with urban wildlife and urban biodiversity. And this is a wonderful story. Here are the smooth-coated otters, which are mostly beloved in Singapore. And there are more than 80 of them in 10 or 11 different families. We have a film, a short 5 or 7 minute film about this on our webpage as well. And the otters have partly returned to Singapore because of the significant actions taken to restore habitat and to repair ecosystems. And a big one is one you see here on the left, a project for naturalizing the Kallang River as it moves through Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park. This is the city's most popular park, and it's a big reason for why the otters returned to Singapore. It's also, by the way, enhances resilience, the resilience of this city, and absorbs floodwaters. And in fact, that's what this image on the left is. You see This used to be an engineered flood channel, essentially, and now it is a biodiverse, meandering, beautiful river. There are other stories of the return of wildness and wild nature to cities. For instance, the return of whales, humpback whales to the waters of New York. Here are some images from another one of our short documentary films. This one is describing the work of a nonprofit called Gotham Whale. It's not a mystery why the whales and other marine life like dolphins are returning to these waters. It's major improvement in water quality. It's a return of the food sources such as the menhaden, but it's really adding an essential dimension, an important dimension to urban life. Much of my own work lately has been around birds in cities and the idea of designing and planning bird-friendly cities. And I strongly argue that if we make cities good for birds, we will make them good for humans. There's an image on the left from a recent Fast Company, a story about the work in a new book on the right. And there's a really important pandemic story here. We face some very serious and do continue to face some very serious mental health challenges during the pandemic. On the left is some statistics from a recent Nature article showing the rise in anxiety and depression pre and during the pandemic. And birds have been a really important form of therapy for a lot of us, and they provide really tremendous mental health benefits. And people are paying a lot more attention to birds during the pandemic. For me, birds are these magical aspects of urban life, and this magical elixir. They animate in really remarkable ways the spaces around us where we live. And there's a lot of evidence, some of it here, that we're watching more birds, that we're buying bird feeders, we're visiting bird conservation sites, we're downloading bird identification books. And actually on the left is a little pie chart from a little survey we did during a webinar in the fall, where we found that 93% of the respondents said that birds were important to them during the pandemic. But we know we have a lot of work to do in designing cities for birds. Upwards of 1 billion birds die each year in the US because of glass, as they strike glass and strike buildings. What you see here is actually images from a bird conservation, bird advocacy group in Toronto called FLAP. And they collect birds, injured and dead birds from the base of buildings they have really an army of volunteers who follow certain routes. And they collect the dead birds and then display them in a very dramatic fashion, usually at the Ontario Science Museum. And it's been an awareness raising device. And I think a lot of us don't realize how many birds are killed by windows and by buildings. So we have a lot of work to do. We need mandatory bird safe design standards. Here's an image from San Francisco. San Francisco is the first US city to have adopted mandatory bird safe standards. Here's also an image from Toronto, Toronto's green standard. Its green standard is the gold standard, really, when it comes to bird safe design, and gradually ratcheting that standard up so that the required pattern densities for fritted glass much higher today than it used to be. We have several short films also about bird-friendly buildings. The one on the upper left is the Interface Carpet headquarters building in Atlanta, which has this really dramatic forest that wraps around the building, and a retrofit project using paracords on the Frick Environmental Center on the right. I'm really out of time at this point, so I'm going to just quickly go through the next few slides, which had to do with making the point that we need to incorporate birds and all wildlife, all biodiversity into our planning. And these are images from our partner city, Edmonton, that has taken a very ecological approach to its planning, incorporating now, it has built the 27th wildlife passage in that city, and actually one of the few cities to incorporate birds and the perspective of birds into its land use planning, using very interesting circuitscape and circuit theory to identify those parts of the landscape that represent barriers for a movement. We also have to celebrate the wildness and the bird life around us, and this is a wonderful story. We also have a film about this, the migrating boxes swifts moving through Portland that nest, or that move into, that roost really, in a elementary school chimney in very dramatic fashion, probably 6,000 birds here. Another wonderful story about burrowing owls and the need to restore habitat in cities and what we can do to make more room and more space for cities. We've got to bring more water into cities. And this is an example of an urban wetland in Perth in Western Australia that basically took a highly chlorinated, energy intensive, biologically sterile water feature and converted it into a wonderful native biodiverse wetland. I've got two more slides, I think. Curra de Bat, Costa Rican city in our network as well. Wonderful story of planting pollinator gardens along sidewalks and streets, and a shift towards native plants and trees. And the image on the left from a story that raises attention or brings attention to the mayor's idea of giving citizenship to butterflies and birds. And this is, I think, my final slide, which is just to make the point that that our biophilic cities have to be regenerative. And this is a wonderful story from our partner city, Wellington, in New Zealand, a project called Zealandia. It's a wild place in the middle of the city where they've erected predator-proof fences as a way of allowing the native birds to rebound. And so today it's been quite successful. And today, as a resident in Wellington, you're likely to encounter one of the native parrots that you see here in your backyard or your front yard. And I like, by the way, the tagline for Zealandia is bringing native birdsong back to Wellington. And I frequently find myself saying that we need to rethink the metrics of what a good city is. And one really good metric for me is if you can hear birdsong, that we ought to maybe, every person in every neighborhood has the right to hear native birdsong. Okay, that's it for me. And sorry to rush through the last few slides, but I'm going to turn it over to Isla at this point to handle some questions, hopefully.
Thank you, Tim, and thanks to all of the panelists. And maybe I could ask all of our panelists to turn your videos back on and just stay muted until, unless you're answering a question. And I would ask our audience to please type any questions you have in the Q&A, and we have time for about 3 to 4 questions. I'm hoping tonight's talks have been thought-provoking, and many of the questions that some of you sent in beforehand have been addressed. Maybe I can start with one of the questions that was sent in from Susie Stone, which is asking, how does a city find a vision? She lives in Jacksonville, referred to her city being bogged down by its past. And one of the challenges is how cities develop these visions, and then how do they get implemented? And I'm going to maybe ask this of Tim and Mona, being the urban designers and planners on the panel, about how this comes about.
Mona, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm starting answering this vision, and also try to answer what I think Aaron asked in the chat, when is affordable housing and the need for public housing coming in. We do a lot of work in New York, and are, for example, working on the new public housing agenda. And the city of New York, for example, developed over the last 100 years the model of the public-private partnership to facilitate this, that has primarily or a lot of profit for the developer. And we are working together with our real estate program to look at new models of public-private partnerships. To answer the question, where are these visions coming from? I mean, in this context, and specifically in New York, I think a lot of these visions are coming from the political leadership. In this case, de Blasio, who really made the point and said we need 300,000 new units in the next 10 years. So it's a combination of political leadership that is willed to step in, public discussion, also resistance to some of these decisions that are maybe made, and then a whole group of creative thinkers across all disciplines. And I'm not only thinking about architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, I'm really thinking about economists, etc., getting together, working on new models. So at the end, in a lot of times, this is created on the political stage through public discussions and then handed over to designers to develop these new models. Sometimes it's vice versa. The designer sees an urge that we need to actually rethink it, and the design comes first, and then the political leadership is convinced that we have to do it.
Yeah, and I would agree with all of that. And our experience has been that innovations can happen from the top if you can convince a mayor, as you're suggesting, Mona. But it's also coming from the bottom, and we have wonderful examples of community-based organizations that have really pushed the agenda, for example, of Biophilic Cities and Nature in Cities. So a group called Biophilly, for instance, in Philadelphia, wonderful name, holding community forums and developing white papers and politically organizing to push a particular vision and agenda. And so I think that those kinds of things can really make a difference.
Thank you both. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit in some of the questions in the chat. Peter Daniel is asking, in relation to the pandemic, there's obviously been a major shift in the use of interior spaces, the square footage required for economic activity, and in some ways, both Shiqiao and Tim, offered that this might be also a way for us to start to rethink the way that we normally operate. I mean, crises have a tendency to disrupt things and can be creative moments. But he's also saying lending and financial institutions could be in an upheaval in the future and dependent upon regulation to establish green space, et cetera. So sort of interested, like, how do you imagine, some of these things happening? I know, Mona, you talked a lot about, tactical forms of occupying spaces, but maybe Shiqiao and Tim, do you have thoughts about how these transformations might occur, especially in relation to COVID and its impacts on cities?
I think COVID kind of brought to the forefront the kind of inherent or underlying conditions, in the term that we use quite often in relation to COVID, underlying conditions that have existed for a long time. My favorite example when I teach, issues on public housing and financial speculation is actually Vienna and Singapore, the way in which they kind of conceptualized and, worked around the issue of public housing, equitable distribution of areas. Tim talked a lot about Singapore's green infrastructure. Singapore, is kind of really situated in a very kind of, fortunate condition where the tropical climate somehow allows everything to grow, grass grow from stones even. But in a way, I think its public kind of housing program and is really interesting. And it's really a state kind of and population joint dance, if you like, in relation to how to invest in a public housing program that really works for Singapore. For those of you who want to look into a little bit more, you should look into the Housing Development Board, the HDB in Singapore, and how they manage public housing and how they actually create public housing equity through that process. Vienna has a totally different model. It's equally fascinating, and it really has, to me, a very, very interesting, lessons for us to learn in terms of how to manage the issue of inequality I think those are the underlying problems that we need to deal with, and pandemic, I don't think itself is not creating these problems. It is really exacerbating the existing conditions.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add much to that. I will echo Shiqiao, your comments about the social housing, public housing story in Singapore. It's really remarkable. And I don't know, 80% of the population, something like that, lives in that housing, and it's wonderfully designed and very biophilic, and it's a wonderful story, actually. I don't know the answer to, I think there are a lot of unanswered or unknown questions about what the pandemic will mean for real estate trends. We're not going to, all of us are not going back to our offices, right? We know that there will be the opportunity for repurposing office space. I think that represents a huge opportunity for more affordable housing, maybe. A lot of discussion about how folks are moving out of the city and looking for smaller cities or less dense urban environments. I'm not sure if that's really going to continue. I am convinced, though, that we will need nature, and that we have rediscovered nature, and that we will want more things in our lives once the pandemic ends, and those things will include whales and otters and birds.
I think we are unfortunately right at the end. So maybe we could take just one more question. So I'm going to take Bruce Malam. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, Bruce. Richmond's problem is the proliferation of parking lots, both structured garages and surface lots. And I was hoping to hear something about the future redevelopment for these lots. Mona, you obviously addressed that quite a bit. Maybe we need to do a project in Richmond. Any thoughts in particular? Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted. Yeah, Bruce, I was in the midst of trying to answer you. So I actually just started a research project in Richmond in collaboration with the planning department under the I-95 project. So proliferation means they are coming more and more, if I'm understanding this correctly. I believe the only way of reducing these are investment into public transit. And for example, the I-95, where the station is located, there are a lot of lots that are laid out, but they are actually for commuters who are getting jump into the bus, etc. So I think the reduction of parking lots is hand in hand with the reduction of traffic. And if we need to build these surfaces, it's very important that we do this in a way that they are not producing more runoff stormwater, that there are surfaces that allow water to penetrate, and that they are multifunctional, that we can use them for other programs and even plant a forest on it. Because if you plant the forest on top of a parking lot, that is not even harming the programming that is supposed to be parking, and allows for heat reduction during the summer.
Thanks, Mona. And I want to thank all of our panelists and certainly all of our attendees again. And you should all feel free to reach out to our panelists at UVA, at the School of Architecture. One of the great things about our disciplines is that we are projective and therefore optimistic. We're world makers, and we are teaching our students, of course, to reimagine the potential futures of cities, architectures, landscapes, and spaces. And some of you have asked, how to get involved with cities as well. If you don't have background, but you should certainly consider joining the School of Architecture. So thanks again, everyone. And we hope to be able to make, I know some of you have also asked about the resources in the chat, if we can make those things available to all of you as well. Thanks again, and good night.
Well, thank you so much to Dean Berman and each of our panelists. This conversation is an example of the depth and experience and knowledge in the University of Virginia School of Architecture. I want to thank the School of Architecture for co-sponsoring this event. A special thanks to Kim Wong-Haggart for her assistance throughout the development of tonight's program. I want to take a moment and bring several upcoming Lifetime Learning programs to your attention. Particular for this audience, in April, Lifetime Learning will be partnering with UVA's Environmental Resilience Institute on a series of events. On Tuesday, April 6th, Frontiers of Climate Science, a 5-year review. Friday, April 9th, Climate Risk and Opportunity for Private Capital. And Tuesday, April 13th, Climate Justice. Descriptions for each of these programs and the featured speakers can be found on the Lifetime Learning website at alumni.virginia.edu/learn. You can register for all of our programs on this site. So thank you again for being with us. Please stay safe and be well and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much.